Hey, folks. So we're here with Ramiro Funez, who's with Anti-Conquista, longtime friend of mine, a great writer, organizer, speaker. He does a lot of great work. He's out in Los Angeles. I think last time I was in Los Angeles, I actually stayed with him and his partner, Ophelia. It was really awesome, but I know him way back from his New York City days, etc. And Ramiro actually was hoping to talk about a book that he just got his hands on, which is probably necessary reading for anyone who's a serious Marxist or revolutionary activist. And that book is called Drugs as Weapons Against Us. And Ramiro, tell us about this book.
What's up, Caleb? How's it going? Thanks again for having me on. I started reading this book maybe a week or two ago. I'm almost done with it. But as I was reading it, I was like, I need to tell Caleb about this book because the same way you talk about the synthetic left, right, which I think is a brilliant thesis, a brilliant analysis that is cutting edge, is so far advanced in terms of analyzing the way that the imperialists, the CIA, have created a fake left in order to, devastate the real tanky left, the core 1920s, 1930s, and also socialism of the 21st century. The same way that there's a synthetic left, the synthetic left needs synthetic drugs in order to propagate that culture. And this is what this book really talks about. This book is by John Potash. It's called Drugs as Weapons Against Us: The CIA's Murderous Targeting of SDS, Panthers, Hendricks, Lenin, Cobain, Tupac, and Other Activists. And when I told a few people about it, when I first started reading it, they were like, oh, what is that? Some nutty conspiracy theory book? And I'm like, this book, this book has extensive sources. Every chapter has links to all the sources, and I checked them myself, and they're actually legitimate sources. So just from the get, if anyone has any doubts as to the legitimacy of the book, everything is sourced here. All of the information is there, and it's a lot of the information that you've been talking about, Caleb, in terms of how to control the left, because something that we've talked about before is like, in the United States, when you're first introduced to leftism, you get of like hippies and drug use and like being sloppy and slovenly and not organized. And that's the fabric of the synthetic left. And this book really goes into talking about how the role of LSD specifically played in fomenting that, in supporting that culture in order to target real revolutionary movements in the US and around the world that were against drug use, that were in favor of improving yourself, because that's something that the imperialists obviously don't want us to do. They don't want us to be sober-minded and clean and efficient. And I myself, to be honest with you and all your listeners and viewers, I've had to deal with that struggle myself. I used to do more psychedelic stuff in the past. I have stopped doing that. And I was able, through your work, but also through this book and other stuff, to realize that all that stuff about LSD and like synthetic drug, it's all designed to stop us from real activism. And so I'm hoping I can read a few excerpts from this book, get your reaction to it, and just spread the word about it, because I think there's some really good information in here.
Sure. Before you read the excerpts, give us the facts. Give us the facts that people need to know. Like, what is true about this? Like, what has actually been definitively proven about the use of drugs against revolutionaries?
One thing that has definitely been proven and is included in this book is the fact that the United States government funded programs like MK Ultra, experiments with drugs, because right before World War II ended, Nazi scientists were experimenting with drugs in terms of ways to control populations. And sadly, they were actually experimenting with drugs on people in concentration camps, which is what the book goes into. You have like Bayer, which is like a German company that at one point was owned by the Nazis, that was testing the origins of LSD and other drugs on people in concentration camps to see their effect. And later, through Operation Paperclip, which was an operation of where the U.S. had some German and Nazi scientists come to the United States to share that information. That's when the CIA really became interested in that and using it as a way to control leftists. And this is all in the book. It has the actual documents where you have like the FBI, the CIA talking about how they're extremely interested in experimenting with LSD use. And so it's 100% factually true that the U.S. government has funded programs to learn about the effects of drugs and has actually used them on different people in order to control and destabilize movements. So that's 100% true. And also another thing that's 100% true from this book that we can tell is that a lot of the New Left were the guinea pigs for these experiments with LSD. You know, when we're talking about Students for a Democratic Society, the Weather Underground, unfortunately later on the Panthers, there were people who were specifically targeted for this stuff, and we'll find out later on of how that ended up. And part of that was supporting this kind of ultra left wing of let's go out and burn shit and do crazy stuff, and those are the people a lot of times who were being who drugs were being pushed on them, more specifically in the Weather Underground, which I thought was really interesting as a way to kind of discredit people and the left. So I thought that was really fascinating, and also Paul Robeson as well.
Okay, so why don't you read us the passages you thought were meaningful?
Yeah, definitely. So this is chapter 2, how the CIA used LSD as a weapon. And so there's this one excerpt here that I wanted to share with y'all. Project MK Ultra was the CIA's umbrella name for at least several projects that use psychedelic drugs against the enemies of the American ruling oligarchy. This was revealed by Martin Lee and Bruce Schlein, who interviewed hundreds of people and read thousands of declassified government documents, books, and articles for their book, Acid Dreams, The Complete Social History of LSD, the CIA, the 60s, and Beyond. Although CIA Director Richard Helms destroyed all of the CIA's MK-Ultra files in 1973, he missed the financial department's files. It is those files and other source material that provided Lee, Schlein, and other researchers with information on the project. One such researcher, Professor Alfred McCoy, the author of The Politics of Heroin, later wrote about CIA projects that led up to MK-Ultra. In his book, A Question of Torture, McCoy wrote that Dr. Kurt Plotner and other Nazi scientists tested mescaline on concentration camp prisoners during World War II. The New York Times wrote that the U.S. Justice Department printed a 600-page secret report in 2006 about the U.S. government's operations saving Plotner and thousands of other Nazis. Writings such as retired Air Force Colonel Walter Boyne, a former director of Washington's Air and Space Museum, wrote an Air Force magazine article about Project Paperclip, better known as Operation Paperclip, that saved at least 700 Nazi scientists. The Joint Chiefs of Staff started these operations in 1945, and the CIA continued them, saying what was originally estimated as 10,000 Nazis from various professions, though the Justice Department found a somewhat lower number of Nazis saved. The operations gave these Nazis employment with the US government, ostensibly to fight communism during the Cold War. Hank Alberetti Jr., a veteran journalist who has also served in President Jimmy Carter's administration, wrote several articles as a book about Operation Paperclip MKUltra, exposing the fact that Operation Paperclip transferred over 1,600 Nazi scientists to the U.S. to work in the former eugenics office known as Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, as well as Brookhaven Nuclear Laboratory on Plum Island, the site of biological weapons experiments. Nazi scientists brought with them their research on psychedelics into offices shared with CIA scientists. And then later on, they talk about in 1938, Albert Hofmann created lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, while working for a Swiss company, Sandoz, a subsidiary of the Nazi IG Farben cartel. The Swiss pharmaceutical industry had previously handled much of the European opium traffic. So these are the same people who were connected with the opium wars. Sandoz then supplied LSD to Nazi doctor Joseph Mengele, who first experimented with it on concentration camp victims. And later on, he talks about MKUltra widens the use of LSD and other drug weapons. Within several years, the CIA combined many of its mind-altering drug programs under the title MKUltra. At the time, former CIA Director Richard Helms was an assistant deputy in charge of covert operations and supervised Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, who ran the program. I think it's pronounced Gottlieb, had worked on other projects and obtained substances from the U.S. Army Special Operations, and he continued to direct the testing of LSD and other substances as potential incapacitants and for the purpose of assassination. Two other areas of MK Ultra focus research included cancer-causing compounds and radiation warfare, the latter of which was almost completely blacked out of CIA documents. The CIA put LSD in the drinks of thousands of unsuspecting people from the 1950s onwards. Jonathan Marks, director of the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the U.S. State Department, described how the CIA started dosing individuals in 1952. CIA leaders came from some of the wealthiest families, and they considered leftists their political opponents. The CIA eventually would develop a hit list of leftist leaders to dose, damage, and discredit, presumably with an extremely large amount of LSD at one time. Marx stated that the involuntary dosing with LSD caused one Argentine leftist professor, an early victim, to act in highly irrational ways that discredited him for several years. As will be discussed in more detail, one of the largest populations of saved Nazis was in Argentina. Syracuse University math professor William A. Pierce was targeted by the CIA's MK-Ultra for speaking out against the McCarthy-era purging of leftist academics. Pierce's math department chair fired two members of his department for alleged activities in, quote, controversial political groups. Pierce said he was considered a left-winger due partly to my membership in peace groups in opposition to the Cold War, but it was primarily my criticism of FBI investigations. The House Un-American Activities Committee investigated Professor Pierce. Pierce moved to Oklahoma State University, where he published a letter criticizing unreasonable psychiatric hospitalizations. A few days later, a police officer and sheriff's deputy arrested Pierce for false reasons, involuntarily committed Pierce, and placed him under the careful, influential MK-Ultra doctor Louis Joylin West. Pierce would never teach again. By 1953, the CIA had ordered 10 kilos of LSD from Sandoz for $240,000. Having already tested LSD many times since 1949, the CIA knew the supply offered 100 million doses. The CIA asked the Eli Lilly pharmaceutical company to try to synthesize LSD. By mid-1954, Eli Lilly broke Sandoz's formula and assured the CIA that in a matter of months, LSD would be available in tonnage quantities. So that's the first excerpt. What do you think about that, Caleb?
Well, I mean, it's not surprising. I know that Paul Robeson was given hallucinogens at one point, right? And that contributed to some of his psychological problems. And that I think also many people have pointed out that it's one thing, I have no experience with hallucinogens whatsoever. But if you take a hallucinogen knowing that you're going to, start hallucinating, that's nowhere near as dangerous as if somebody slips you one. Because if you have no idea that you've been given a hallucinogen and suddenly you're seeing things, it can be really, really psychologically damaging and have, because you're shocked. You think you're losing your mind when in reality you've been given a hallucinogen. One thing that's also interesting is, Aldous Huxley. He wrote this book called Brave New World, the science fiction book that was popular in the 1930s. Have you read Brave New World?
I actually haven't read it, but there's a whole chapter on that book in this book.
No kidding. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he was also a big advocate of hallucinogens. He wrote a book called The Doors of Perception, which was a book that was a big part of 60s drug culture, even though he wrote it a long time ago. But in his book Brave New World, he has this vision of the world where the population, the masses, are controlled by drugs, right? And it's this drug called Soma that people take and they're high all the time, and it's a way to control them. And that in Brave New World, he's kind of talking about social engineering. And I think that's particularly interesting. What does the book say about Aldous Huxley?
Yeah, he let me actually go to that part. There's a whole section about it that is pretty interesting. But basically, there was a whole effort by the CIA to promote literature, to promote information about LSD, to promote it. And actually, Time Magazine was like a central part of that. One of the owners of Time Magazine was like really involved with promoting LSD and the whole hippie culture. Let me see if I can find the Brave New World section. But I think one of the things that I find interesting as well is the fact that the effects of psychedelics, right? I've taken, as I mentioned before, I'm going to be real with you. I've taken psychedelics before. And one of the effects is that you start to feel like everything is relative, that there is no objective truth. Everything can, you can fly if you want to, and that's recorded in this book as well, is that people feel that they can fly, that they can have superpowers. And that's one of the things that I think translates over to the ideology of the postmodern left, where there is no objective truth, like you said, with the synthetic left. There is no objective reality. And I think that part of LSD culture and use is that whole feeling of like you can do whatever you want. There is no correct way of doing things, and I just think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, no, I remember one of the stoners at my high school was telling me about when they were on acid. They said, you see what the world really looks like when you're on acid. And I remember thinking, like, I don't think it really looks like that. I think you're hallucinating, right? You know what I'm saying? But it's like, but a lot of people that are really, really into hallucinogens get into this point where it's almost like the hallucinations never really stop, right? They intensify when they take the drug, but they're almost at the point where their brain has been so kind of fried that hallucinations never really end. I've heard about that. I mean,
that's true.
And that's very, very frightening. That's very, very frightening. It's weird because I remember, when I was in high school, I was very interested in the musical Hair. I discovered the musical Hair, and there's a whole like song in Hair about using LSD, walking in space, and I thought LSD was very cool. I just had extremely strict parents, and I was in a very small town, so there was no way I was going to get to use drugs. So I didn't, thank goodness. But I remember I thought, as I was getting interested in the left and counterculture, I thought that was a big part of being a leftist was drug culture. And I didn't realize that there was this whole history of communists rejecting drug use and such. And I learned that later. But it's very fascinating. But what else can we learn from the book?
Yeah, so let me read you another excerpt from it. I found one part that he talks about Huxley. He says, Dr. Humphrey Osmond coined the term psychedelic, meaning mind manifesting. Osmond's work to popularize acid led him to enlist Brave New World author Aldous Huxley as a proponent of psychedelics. Brave New World, published in 1932, was listed by many literary organizations as one of the most important novels of the century. Osmond first gave mescaline to Huxley in May of 1953. Huxley wrote about the experience in The Doors of Perception, as you mentioned. Osmond continued his LSD experiments at Princeton University. While Huxley worked on another book, Hubbard supplied him with his second mescaline trip before introducing LSD later in the year. Captain Hubbard impressed Huxley with his connections to the top echelons of American business and government, which Huxley believed was due partly to Hubbard's fortune made as a uranium entrepreneur. Huxley promoted psychedelics in his last books, despite the themes of Brave New World, which warned of rulers keeping people content with their lot through the use of escapist drugs, just like you mentioned. And this excerpt talks a little bit more about the CIA intelligence experimenting with LSD abroad, especially in Africa. U.S. intelligence worked in collaboration with British and other European intelligence agencies to stop African independence. These independence movements cost the wealthy corporate owners in their countries hundreds of millions of dollars. Intelligence agencies used guns and drugs against the African independence movements in both open and surreptitious actions. The CIA's use of drugs for this purpose remains a part of their covert operations, with few details revealed. CIA documents state how the agency used LSD to aid interrogation on an operational basis from the mid-1950s through the early 1960s. As previously mentioned, the CIA also used LSD against foreign leftist leaders. A CIA document noted that the CIA's administration of LSD to, quote, high officials would be a relatively simple matter and could have a significant effect at key meetings, speeches, etc. The agency planned to slip odorless, tasteless LSD to, quote, socialist or left-leaning politicians in foreign countries so that they could babble incoherently and discredit themselves in public. Wow. The CIA certainly wasn't looking to cause mind expansion. Their own documents said the acid could, quote, produce serious insanity for 8 to 18 hours and possibly longer. ABC News showed CIA documents citing how CIA MKUltra's Dr. Sidney Gottlieb carried LSD overseas to dose leftist foreign diplomats and statesmen. Egyptian President Jamal Abdel Nasser, one of Africa's most outspoken leaders, was on the hit list. The CIA concealed exactly how and if the leaders on that hit list were dosed, but did they give these leaders massive LSD doses in an attempt to also cause subtle brain damage? The assassination of Congo independence leader Patrice Lumumba represents a well-documented example of US and European attacks on African independence leaders with MK Ultra scientist aid. The US became the first country to recognize the claims of Belgium's King Leopold II to the territories of the Congo Basin. Brutal economic exploitation under Leopold II resulted in millions of Congolese deaths. The US acquired a stake in Congo's minerals. The US military used uranium from Congolese mines for manufacturing atomic weapons. As various African countries began to gain their independence, the Belgian Congo's Patrice Lumumba organized the Mouvement National Congolese in 1958. The Congolese people elected the 34-year-old to be their prime minister in 1960. In his acceptance speech, Lumumba said Congo's independence put an end to the humiliating slavery which was imposed on us by force. About 10 weeks after Lumumba took office, Colonel Joseph Mobutu led a coup d'etat backed by Belgian officers still in the Congolese army. Many reports implicate the CIA in helping orchestrate this coup. The Congressional Church Committee found that CIA Director Alan Dulles ordered Lumumba's assassination. The CIA's MK-Ultra director Sidney Gottlieb aided this assassination, devising a poison resembling toothpaste, and he flew to the Congo with it. Lumumba was assassinated in January of 1961. Details on the role of the poison in the assassination remain unclear. And this is a copy of the CIA file where they talk about Lumumba and connected with MK Ultra, which I found really interesting.
Very, very interesting. Yeah. It's interesting. There was a movie that came out. I think it starred Matt Damon, and it came out in like 2008, perhaps. I think, and it was about CIA, someone who joins the CIA, and it shows a little bit of this. It shows them using LSD to torture someone. It shows their involvement in coups. Do you remember this? Have you ever seen this movie? I think it's called The Good Shepherd. I think it's called The Good Shepherd, and it's like the life of a CIA guy. And many people saw it as almost kind of an imitation of like the Bush family or something like that. I remember that. It's very interesting. The other thing is Dr. Timothy Leary has always been kind of a sketch figure, right? He's at Harvard, which is, that's where these CIA experiments were going on with LSD. He's a psychology professor at Harvard, and then he just has this realization that LSD is the greatest thing. And he gets fired from Harvard, and he just goes around the country with lots of money, and he's set up this whole foundation for promoting LSD. And then he's arrested and taken to jail, and then he's broken out of jail by the weathermen. And then he's running around, and he's in Algeria, and then they finally catch him in Afghanistan, and he comes back to the United States, and he does like 8 months in prison. And then it's been revealed that from the time he got out of jail up until his death, he was an FBI informer, and he would go around giving the same kind of speeches encouraging drug use, but then, inform to the FBI, everyone who came to his lectures and all of that. Very shady individual. What does the book say about Dr. Timothy Leary?
Yeah, there's also a lot of information about Dr. Timothy Leary that talks about his travels abroad. I actually have a section on that here. Let me just pull it up. Yeah, they talk about Leary and activism. So this is one section that I found interesting. The increase of activism coincided with an increase of U.S. intelligence's spread of LSD. Along with American agents who worked on spreading LSD, help came from MI6, the British version of the CIA. While a former MI6 agent claimed MI6 supervised the CIA's work promulgating LSD and other drug use, the truth of this can't be ascertained. As previously noted, Britain's Tavistock Institute ran a congruent operation with the CIA's MK-Ultra regarding the use of acid as a spy weapon. Britain's Michael Hollingshead dosed many unsuspecting foreign leaders through his job at the United Nations. Hollingshead threw parties at his Fifth Avenue apartment where he invited people from the UN, reportedly covering his entire apartment with LSD, so anyone who touched anything got a dose of acid involuntarily.
Jeez.
In a memoir, Hollingshead said he was on a, quote, crusade to launch LSD on the world. Hollingshead's links to the CIA and British intelligence suggest the more insidious shared motives of the CIA's Dr. Sidney Gottlieb and Richard Helms. Hollingshead said in 1961 he worked as an executive secretary of the Institute for British American Cultural Exchange, a semi-official British propaganda agency in the field of international cultural relations where creating propaganda was a primary task. British police detective Dick Lee called Hollingshead's organization the British Council, which was heavily funded by King George VI in 1940. Hollingshead admitted he got funding for his group from the Rockefeller Institute. This institute channeled CIA funds for MKUltra projects at universities. Nelson Rockefeller sat on the National Security Council in the 1950s, which decided to okay CIA funding for these MKUltra projects. Hollingshead further revealed that CIA asset Lionel Trilling served on his institute for the British American Cultural Exchange's board of directors. For her book, The Cultural Cold War, Frances Stoner Saunders interviewed people who verified that Trilling knowingly accepted CIA aid for his work over many years and was highly involved in CIA work. And then he goes into talking about more about LSD and Timothy Leary. In 1964, when William S. Burroughs printed his warnings about LSD, the CIA's MKUltra projects already had vast covert programs to promote its use on both American coasts. On the East Coast at Boston's Harvard University, psychology professor Timothy Leary ran experiments also conducted at other schools nationwide, where professors received grants to pay students to take psychedelic drugs. A group called the Human Ecology Fund gave Leary and other professors the money for this work. MKUltra scientists gave depositions about the start of the Human Ecology Fund. The CIA started it in 1959 at Cornell University Medical School in New York City as a covert funding source for various MKUltra projects. Besides Cornell and Harvard, it involved other prestigious universities near hotbeds of student activism, such as Stanford University near Berkeley, California, and Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, where student-led civil rights activism had made considerable headway. Harvard, Stanford, Hopkins, Yale had all been hotbeds for eugenics, suggesting why they spearheaded these experiments. And these schools became epicenters for MKUltra activities, paying student volunteers to take part in experiments with psychedelics, from mushrooms to LSD. Many of the volunteers had poor ethnic immigrant backgrounds and were in need of the money to help pay for their way in school. In total, the CIA allocated $7 to $13 million for 44 colleges and universities to conduct this research. Up to this time, Professor Leary had done tests only with psilocybin, which is mushrooms. Leary hadn't tried LSD and said he wasn't eager to begin, as he believed one psychedelic was like all others. Lee noted that Hollingshead gave Leary about 6 times the normal dose of acid, which had Leary tripping for 3 days. The experience led Leary to consider Hollingshead his guru. Leary's closest Harvard psilocybin project associates, Richard Alpert and Ralph Metzner, were upset to see Leary in a helpless state and blamed Hollingshead for having blown Leary's mind. Lee described Hollingshead as a very witty, and the pot-bellied Brit eventually convinced doubters Alpert and Metzner, along with other Harvard associates, to sample the acid from his mayonnaise jar. Soon after, they started using LSD as part of their research. This fell in line with the CIA MKUltra goals regarding LSD. The United States Senate Church Committee would eventually investigate and push a little-known report detailing MKUltra. It stated that one goal of MKUltra was to manipulate foreign leaders after dosing them with LSD. The Senate Select Committee's report cited a memorandum from the Director Security saying artichoke restatement of program. It stated that the CIA was using LSD in order to develop means for the control of the activities and mental capacities of individuals, whether willing or not. This source also cited the use of LSD on unwitting Americans. This and other evidence indicates MKUltra similarly working against American cultural and political leaders at the time. Through Timothy Leary, Hollingshead met top jazz artists such as white trumpet player Maynard Ferguson. Hollingshead smoked a joint with Ferguson and his wife and told them about acid. By the end of the night, Hollingshead had the Fergusons sampling his mayonnaise jar supply. In an interview later in life, Leary admitted that within a year of his first acid trip, quote, "I was working as an intelligence agent since 1962. I was a witting agent of the CIA."
Wow. Wow. Well, one thing that I think also it's almost like, I grew up in the 90s, the war on drugs era. I mean, with the 80s was the most intense part of the war on drugs, but I was a kid in the 90s in Ohio, and I remember that like the "don't do drugs" propaganda was so stupid that it almost helped the drug culture. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Because
dare to resist or whatever.
oh yeah, we had Dare. Police officers came in and showed us videos, and and they were just so stupid, and they were pushing mass incarceration at the time, right? So it was like a 1-2 punch. Like you push drugs everywhere, right, and then you push mass incarceration and the war on drugs, and it's like they both kind of walked hand in hand in this weird way, right? You put drugs everywhere, then you make everyone scared of drugs, right? And they both serve the ruling class. Can you talk about that some?
Yeah, I think it's definitely true because especially at that time period in the 80s, we of course have to talk about the Contras, right? From Nicaragua, who my family in Honduras, my dad, he's actually from the city that borders Nicaragua called Choluteca, which is the base of where the U.S. imperialists were training the Contras, because it's like a 20-minute drive from Nicaragua. And so that's where they trained them. And my father's side of the family was able to see like all of the contra activities in that area. And of course, a big part of that was drugs, bringing in drugs, not just cocaine, but also opium, heroin, and a lot of drugs. And what's interesting is that there's also, I'm me personally, I'm not religious, but I think I tend to side in Central America with the Roman Catholic Church that tends to be more progressive. And it's interesting because a lot of Catholic socialists in Nicaragua and Honduras at the time were speaking about the satanic nature of the Contras because of the drug use, not only because of the effects of the drugs, but also from where they came from. Let's not forget that the Nazis who were experimenting with the stuff a long time ago were really obsessed with the occult, were really obsessed with alchemy and the idea of controlling people with potions and magic and spells. And so a lot of Catholic socialists at the time in Nicaragua were speaking out against the Contras as bringing these spells like witchcraft, and oppressing people because it completely devastated the region. I mean, you talk to people from Central America, before who were alive to see how it was before the 80s and after, and it was completely night and day. And in a sense, there's kind of like this satanic element to drugs that in a spiritual level that I think is really interesting. And I think that like the media, like, and that's kind of like what this book talks about is that the people who were speaking out against drugs were portrayed as like conservative and uptight and like, oh, they're so, hard and they're closed-minded. Just open up your mind, take some drugs, relax. And that psychological switch, when you talk about Zbigniew Brzezinski and his ability to rebrand imperialism, his ability to brand the imperialists as progressive, as hippies, that was such a key part of that, because then, that's how they were able to destroy so many movements. And even, in the 80s, like there was unfortunately some movements on the left that were forced into getting involved with drug trade as well. Unfortunately, some people who were, kicked out of certain leftist groups in Latin America, they were getting involved with that. And it's just insane because the 80s, you talk about like drugs and capitalism, it's all connected at that time period.
Well, all these people who want to give a body count to communism, right? So look at Latin America before the 80s and look at it now, right? Central America, Mexico, South America, and who created the drug narco apparatus, right? I mean, that was largely the work of the CIA and Western capitalism, right? Now you look at Honduras today, you look at Guatemala today, you look at how many lives have been destroyed. If they were going to do that thing where every person who ever died in the Soviet Union is personally Stalin's fault, if you were going to add up a body count, for how many people Western capitalism, the United States, killed by creating the drug wars in South and Central America, it would be in the millions, right? I mean, many millions, wouldn't you say?
Oh, definitely, countless amounts of people, and it's insane because that never gets talked about, and it's something that to this day still affects people. The drug trade, the promotion of drugs, and it's just really insane. There's this other section.
The man-made famine, right? I mean,
right.
This is a Holocaust, basically. I mean, when they find dead bodies every day along the U.S. border, right? You know what I'm saying? Of people trying to flee from this narco chaos. I mean, this is a holocaust created by Western capitalism and imperialism by reducing countries throughout Central America to chaos with drugs, right? I mean, this is it's like, I'm sorry, but if you're gonna blame Stalin for every death in the Ukraine in the 1930s, look at what the Western capitalists have done, and it hasn't stopped. They're still doing it, right? And I mean, we hand over weapons to the Mexican police, and then like half those weapons end up in the hands of the drug cartels. I mean, this is for real, right? This is real stuff going on here. This is a crime of capitalism.
That's exactly right. And drugs are, such a big part of that. And there's this other chapter here, chapter 8. It's called CIA Acid Fest Counter Protest, talking about going back to the theme of the synthetic drugs used to create a synthetic left and control it. I think there's this excerpt here that might be interesting to you, Caleb. A top CIA-connected think tank, the Rand Corporation, headquartered in Santa Monica, California, played a crucial role in designing strategies for counter-revolution and pacification, both in Vietnam and against anti-war Americans. A 1962 Rand report revealed that LSD could lead those in left-wing organizations to, quote, resign or become inactive. Evidence shows that the CIA's MK-Ultra operations first dosed various leaders in politics and the arts, then had their media assets spotlight these leaders in a sophisticated way to make them well-known countercultural figures. They often coupled them with undercover agents in propaganda campaigns to promote LSD to leftists. In February of 1965, President Lyndon Johnson initiated Operation Flaming Dart, a major expansion of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. It included the bombing of North Vietnam as well as the first use of U.S. ground troops to fight the Viet Cong. The Students for a Democratic Society at the University of Michigan held the first anti-war teach-in, and other SDS chapters began to follow suit. In October of 1965, UC Berkeley students led by free speech veteran organizers, including Jerry Rubin, Mike Rossman, held one of the nation's largest events at an all-day teach-in to protest the Vietnam War. Throughout the next 14 months, Berkeley activists recruited more and more anti-war protesters for rallies and campus strikes. Berkeley students inspired other students' actions nationwide. Many students joined SDS. By October of 1965, SDS had grown into a massive organization of leftist students with 10,000 members and chapters in 89 schools. By the end of that
let me interrupt.
Yeah.
Who were among those protesters? The parents of Kamala Harris. That's where they met at the
really
protest. Yes, yes.
I haven't gotten to that part of your book.
yeah, but keep reading.
Wow, that's crazy. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
By the end of that school year, it added 5,000 more members and nearly doubled its chapters to 172 schools. The psychological handling of writer Ken Kesey to lead youth to acid went astray when Kesey urged people to, quote, graduate from LSD. By the end of 1966, Kesey, seen as the figurehead of the acid test, moved from California and the UC Berkeley area to Oregon. Ken Babbs and other pranksters moved with Kesey. They eventually changed Kesey's mind about stopping acid and urging others to stop using it. They would also promote acid in their Dayglow bus events, such as Woodstock. While some of the pranksters moved in with him, a few key people involved in the acid test stayed in the San Francisco Bay Area. These included top LSD trafficker Owsley Stanley and chemist Tim Scully. Within a year, these two and their cohorts had vastly expanded the size of the acid test. While Owsley had manufactured a lot of acid before the mid-1960s, with Scully, he set up a large LSD laboratory in Richmond, California in the spring of 1966. Top MK-Ultra scientists attended Owsley's acid test parties. Also, former Grateful Dead manager and advisor Hank Harrison said Owsley and Scully worked with William Mellon Hitchcock by 1965. This and other evidence suggests that Owsley was working undercover for the CIA and helping set up acid tests as LSD promotion events for MK-Ultra in a way that would make LSD production appear as, quote, a grassroots phenomena. Owsley had a network of acid dealers who helped expand San Francisco's LSD scene. Alan Cohen dealt acid for Owsley, turned on brothers Ron and Jay fell into acid, and then worked with them when they started the Psychedelic Shop. Cohen also became an editor of the Psychedelic Rangers newspaper, The Oracle. Similar to Ozzy setting up acid tests with top CIA MK Ultra scientists in attendance, John Cook, a man with multiple links to US intelligence, started the Psychedelic Rangers. Cook had a close relationship with his sister and brother-in-law, Alice and Roger Kent, the latter a major figure in the California Democratic Party. Cook also regularly partied with Roger's brother, Sherman Kent. Researchers Lee and Schlein said Sherman Kent headed the CIA's National Board of Estimates and served as CIA Director Allen Dulles' right-hand man during the Cold War. Cook also made the acquaintance of a number of CIA operatives while traveling in Europe. Cook's government connections were legion. During the 60s, Cook worked out of Mexico, where he met with researcher Andrija Puharich, who ran parapsychology and drug experiments for the US military in the late 1950s, and Seymour Lazar, a wealthy business associate of William Mellon Hitchcock. Cook's funding sources were unknown, but they were lavish, affording him the ability to send off 6 of his psychedelic rangers to various psychedelic hotspots in North America and Europe. In 1966, sent Michael Bowen to settle in Haight-Ashbury, which is in the Bay Area, and the two maintained constant communication. Bowen helped start a psychedelic newspaper, The Oracle, in San Francisco around the time of Berkeley activism. Bowen had Oracle organizers at his house where they set up acid test type events, a love pageant rally in 1966, and then the first, quote, human being. They dubbed it a powwow, a gathering of tribes. Michael Bowen and the Oracle reportedly held the first human being in 1967 in order to, quote, psychedelicize the radical political left. If William S. Burroughs and a number of research articles are correct, they sought to do the CIA's bidding in making the radical left less competent.
Indeed. And that is so true. That is so true. And, it's interesting because, you and I have both spent our time around like some of the hardline Marxist-Leninist groups. And those groups generally didn't tolerate drug use. They had a rule against it. But even among them, there's a lot of people who are in recovery, who spent a long time, because they were in the radical movements, because they were protesting, they ended up, getting wrapped up in drugs and it damaged them. And there's a lot of people, in the organized political left, a lot of baby boomer activists who have been very badly affected by this, because everywhere you went where people were protesting for civil rights or protesting against the Vietnam War, the drug culture was there. And that was not an accident, according to what you're reading. So it's fascinating,
Yeah, it's really interesting. And in this part, they talk about SDS a little bit more, which is pretty interesting. By 1968, the U.S. military ramped up its war effort, drafting young Americans to war. Meanwhile, membership in SDS was enjoying a strong growth spurt, thanks to, in large part, to the actions of Columbia University chapter regarding the military draft. Leading SDS historian Kirkpatrick Sale wrote in his definitive history, SDS, that despite this revelation, Columbia was going through the doldrums that practically every chapter encountered at one time or another. Several of the former chapter leaders had graduated or dropped out. Drugs proved a more satisfying answer than the politics for many, and certainly less frustrating. Not only did drug use lead many away from SDS, police also arrested SDSers for weed possession, which lessened their likelihood to continue their political work and having to worry about their legal problems. Columbia SDS leadership broke into 2 groups regarding the way it approached activism. One side was referred to as the Praxis axis, right, as it revolved around the Praxis theoretical paper insert as part of the national SDS newspaper New Left and Notes. Ted Kapchuk, Ted Gold, and Dave Gilbert led this more theoretically oriented Praxis axis, which emphasized writing and debating leftist political theory to educate others. Mark Rudd and John Jacobs led the other group, labeled the Action Faction, that sought more often to put theory into action. Kirkpatrick Sale said this kind of split happened in SDS chapters nationwide. The Action Faction picketed and then held a sit-in to protest Dow Chemical Company recruiters. Dow manufactured incendiary jellied gasoline, napalm, dropped on vast swaths of Vietnam. The faction also threw a meringue pie in the face of a recruiting officer who came to promote the military to students. By late March of 1968, Rudd led 100 people through the Roman pillars of the university's low library administration. They delivered a petition against the school's involvement with the Institute for Defense Analysis. Columbia placed Rudd, Jacobs, Gold, and 3 other SDS leaders on probation for that action. The action faction of SDS then outvoted the Praxis axis for a rally and march to the president's office opposing the probation of 6 SDS leaders with a contingency plan that few took seriously to occupy and blockade the office. This SDS action on April 23rd sparked an unprecedented anti-war rally. This uprising gained particular significance because New York was the media capital of the world. Reporters and photographers sent images of the strike around the country and the world that effectively inspired other student protests. And then they talk about Berkeley activism as well with SDS, and how basically SDS leaders were battling with psychedelics. They talk about this publication called Seed, which is linked to U.S. intelligence. They talk about New Left Notes. This lawyer named Bernardine Dorn, who says gravitated toward the psychedelic hippie scene, but it didn't yet appear to affect her competence. She worked with Martin Luther King Jr. in the mid-1960s, organizing students around both anti-war activities and civil rights. And then basically it goes into how she took LSD and it basically kind of ruined her life. And
Bernadine Dorn, she ended up becoming the weather, leader of the weather. Yeah. I mean, and she's married to Bill Ayers. That's fascinating, and it's also interesting. You talked about Columbia, the Praxis axis versus the action faction, right? And the action faction was led by Mark Rudd, who was eventually became a Weather Underground terrorist, whereas the Praxis axis was around the Progressive Labor Party and such. And then, from my understanding, those labels were actually invented. Those two names were given to the two groups by Lynn Marcus. And Lynn Marcus was somebody who was giving classes near Columbia University, like Marxism classes, in an apartment. He would rent an apartment and fill the apartment with students who would come and listen to his Marxism lectures. And they eventually formed the SDS Labor Committee. Lynn Marcus, his actual legal name is Lyndon LaRouche, and that's where the LaRouche movement comes out of. They also come out of Columbia. They were the SDS Labor Committee that was neither for the Praxis axis or the action faction, but gave that label to both groups. So that was pretty definitive, what happened at Columbia. It was similar, though, to what was happening at Berkeley. There's a very good documentary, Berkeley in the 60s, which talks about that. And Bob Avakian comes out of Berkeley. And the ISO, the International Socialist Organization, they came out of Berkeley. They were the independent socialist clubs of Berkeley. And this is just the new left. I mean, this is new left history. And it's the remnants of this that is what's calling itself communist in the United States right now. And it's so damaged by so much, And I spent a long time thinking that if we could just learn from what these folks from the 60s, knew, we could build something effective now, only to realize that what they built was a very, very ineffective thing that was, influenced by all kinds of CIA manipulation. And that we're living in very, very different times. I mean, there was a booming economy in the 1960s, for example. The economy was really, really good in the 1960s. The post-war economic expansion didn't really end until 1971 or 73, some people say. So because of that, the economy was so good, average Americans didn't want anything to do with communists or activists, right? And so the left kind of learned to function in these little kind of isolated spaces, the counterculture, et cetera. And there's only so much we can learn from that era because of that.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and I think it's just this book, your work about the synthetic left, has opened my eyes to the reality of what real leftism is, especially around the world, because in the U.S., I think that's the reason why so many people in the U.S. gravitate toward the right, because they see the right wing as being clean, organized, about hard work, about improving yourself, keeping yourself, clean and healthy. And the left has been associated with that synthetic left that you talk about, this hippie nonsense, not showering, taking drugs, and not believing in objective reality and objective truth. And the Ben Shapiro phrase, facts don't care about your feelings, that just encapsulates how the right wing has been able to hijack real socialism and leftism. Because as revolutionaries, we believe in objective truth, we believe in reality. And the left has come to be associated with radical relativism. And I think that these synthetic drugs have played such a big part in that, in rebranding leftists as these hippies and people who don't get anything done. And that's why a lot of, especially older folks, tend to be turned off by that. And it's just fascinating to see. I mean, there's so much more in this book, they go into
before you go there, though, I think what you're raising is very important because it raises the question of what does freedom really mean?
Yeah.
Right? Because it's very interesting. The studies I've often talked about this, but this concept of behaviorism, right? So William F. Skinner is the father of behaviorism, and he's out of Harvard or wherever. He's this very famous American psychologist, and he's studying how do you control people, basically how do you manipulate people's behavior. And he discovers that the least effective method for controlling someone's behavior is to punish them. Because if you just punish somebody, they will just feel like they've been unfairly punished, right? And that no matter what, when you punish somebody, people will often just find a way to be a victim when you punish them, right? Because they're a victim, right? You punished me, I'm a victim, you're being cruel by punishing me, and people can just whatever. Whereas, if you reward someone, right? People do not, they do not respond negatively to rewards. No, if you get a reward, you never go, oh, I didn't deserve it. You're trying to manipulate. No, I mean, everyone takes a reward, right? So it's far more effective to manipulate people by rewarding them rather than by punishing them, right? However, what you can learn to do is you reward, but you stop the reward, right? And then all of a sudden the person's like, oh, why am I not getting the reward anymore? What do I need to do to start getting the reward again? Right? And what that is very similar to how drug addiction works, right? The person, they're getting high. Suddenly they can't get high anymore. So how do I change my behavior so I can get high again? Right? And it's the work on behaviorism. How do you manipulate people? It's basically how do you turn people into addicts, right? And when you set up a system where you're punishing people, that seems very authoritarian. But in a way, you're asserting less control over them. It's less effective, right? A person can maintain their intellectual freedom while being punished. They can say, you know what, you are wrong. I am a victim. And whereas somebody who has become addicted to the reward and becomes manipulated in that way loses their psychological freedom, right? So you talked about Satan and mind control and all of that. That's essentially kind of what's going on here, right? And the weird thing is, throughout the history of human civilization, and you can talk about European civilization, you can talk about Christianity. I mean, what is the symbol of Christianity, right? It's a man dying on a cross in this painful way, taking like the most horrendous punishment, for his principles, right? And that's what it meant to be a hero. Joan of Arc is considered to be a great hero, right? She refused, she wore men's clothes, she led soldiers into battle, so she's burned at the stake. She's a great hero, right? And the great heroes, you talk about Braveheart, right? The movie Braveheart, where he's like, having his guts pulled out, and he shouts, freedom! That the hero is one who will stand by their principles and endure horrendous suffering. That's how one becomes heroic, right? But if one is manipulated, not with the threat of punishment, but with this kind of manipulation through reward, right? That they lose their ability to be heroic, right? They lose their kind of psychological strength, and they become kind of manipulated and just kind of a weak person that's kind of chasing after the next reward. Can I get the reward next? Can I get the reward next? And it really kind of shows that it raises the question of what is freedom. You think of a society where people are walking around terrified of being punished. Well, they're not free, right? But if you have a society where everyone's just being psychologically programmed with rewards, which is kind of what Brave New World and Aldous Huxley is kind of talking about, right? Are they more free or not, right? That raises the question, and that a lot of the older notions that we have about honor and sacrifice and all of that get kind of taken away when you have a society where people are instead being socially engineered and programmed. It's very fascinating to think about what is freedom.
It reminds me a lot about social media when you were talking about rewards. It's like every time you log into Facebook or Instagram and you get that like or that share, you get like a little dopamine hit that kind of like sets you off. And it's interesting to see interviews with engineers, social media engineers, how they designed it very similar to like a casino, to like a slot machine. Every time, you get you win something, that like a little piece of dopamine gets hit. And it's really sad as well to see its effect on older generations. Like my family, my aunts and uncles, my parents, like they're on Facebook like the whole day, and it's interesting. And then like kind of like people who are around our age tend to be more on Instagram.
It's not random. The algorithms decide what they want to reward for and what they don't. And in a way, it's a very, very effective means of social engineering, right? I mean, not just a means of surveillance, right? Because you're posting everything on there. They know where you are exactly, but also a means of programming you, right? Some things get likes, some things don't, and that is kind of the similar thing, right? And that this is what the managerial bourgeoisie is all about. How do we program society, right, to fit our agenda? And if you look at the agenda of the Rockefellers, you look at the agenda of Silicon Valley, they want to reduce the human population, they want to reduce the level of consumption in society, right? And they want to overthrow all the anti-imperialist states, right? And they want to immerse the United States into a global economy where everyone's living standards are gradually going down, and the rule of big oil companies and banks is just kind of secured globally. Whereas Trump and the lower levels of American capital, they're just selfish. They just want to make profits. They don't care. They just want to make profits, right? They're selfish, and they're racist, and they're sexist, and they're awful, but they just want to make profits, right? And so it's like I mean, as we head to this election, right? Which do you want? Do you want that managerial evil that really knows what it's doing and has a really effective plan to do it? Or do you just want, this stupid, racist, awful, traditionally authoritarian evil, right? That's all about cops and prison. I mean, and it's like, at the end of the day, neither. I don't want either of those things, but that's kind of what we're dealing with. And this drug, debate kind of shows it, right? And at the end of the day, right, I mean, they've got it both ways. They've got the prisons and the mass incarceration and the stupid DARE programs. I hated DARE. Yeah. I mean, I would open the encyclopedia and it would say that marijuana is not chemically addictive, which it's not, right? It's not, right? And I remember that, and I would raise my hand in the class and I'd say, marijuana is not chemically addictive. And they would say, well, yeah, but it's psychologically addictive. And I would say, well, a lot of things are psychologically addictive. I don't advocate using marijuana. I think it can do long-term damage to one's memory. What was I talking about again? I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like, and it's not a good substance to do, but in terms of it's not heroin, right? I mean, you don't get addicted to it. But when they distort that, when they lie, I would get very angry. And the other thing is that, I think one can be for legalizing drugs, which I'm for. I think drugs should be legal, and not be in favor of using them, right? And that is not often understood, right? That when I was in school, I would want to write a paper. I was told many times I was not allowed to write a paper about advocating the legalization of drugs. And I would say, I'm not for using drugs. I just think that we shouldn't be locking people in jail for it. No, you can't write this paper. We're not allowed to discuss legalization. No, I'm in favor of legalizing drugs. People shouldn't be in jail for using them. They should have treatment. They should have community services should be available, but they shouldn't be locked up. But that doesn't mean we should embrace them as a movement and say that, smoking weed or doing drugs or getting high on different substances or hallucinate. We shouldn't say that's a good thing, right? That there is nuance in all of this, right? And there are some people that are going to see this video. I know people that are going to see this video, Caleb and Ramiro, drugs is weapon against us. They're going to roll their eyes and they're going to think of the DARE, cop who came into their class and said dumb things. I remember like the police officer who came to my school for DARE. Like one of the things he said is, why would anyone want to take LSD? You see things that aren't there. Like, just like ignorant, right. So it's like that anti-drug stuff is so stupid, right? That it makes people then deflect to, you know what I'm saying? It's that kind of, that kind of thinking. And there's nuance there. There's nuance in all things.
Yeah, it's kind of like reverse psychology. Like whenever you bring up DARE, the shirts, like the DARE to resist, the first thing that people think about is mocking it.
Right.
Like, people don't think of it as like, oh yeah, that's a great slogan. It's like, oh yeah, that corny slogan, and then it has like kind of the reverse effect where it's like people are like, oh, that's so like conservative and hardline, and I'm actually gonna do it. What I wanted to ask you, Caleb, kind of wrapping up, is like, what advice would you have for people, especially young people, who are overcoming addictions or drug use, who are just starting out, maybe are new to leftism, and unfortunately the circles around them are really promoting drug use. But what advice would you have for people who want to get out of that? For me personally, what helped me out is one of the books that really helped open my mind was Kim Il-sung, actually, in DPRK, talking about just like everyday life. Kim Il-sung's books are really great because he talks about everything from like super theoretical communism to just day-to-day stuff of like how a communist should act in day-to-day aspects. And just talking about, exercising, working out, having a clear mind, being able to work and serve the people. And so for me, I think like seeing other leftists around the world, seeing their stuff helped me. But what would you say would be a good way?
I think you're really onto something there, Ramiro, because I will tell you it was a life-changing experience for me in 2013 when I went to the World Festival of Youth and Students, and I met communists not from the United States and Western Europe. When I met communists from Africa and Asia and Latin America, and they wore suits and ties, and they were, responsible politicians, and they, on the one hand, they weren't reformists. They understood Marx and Lenin up and down, backwards and forwards. But at the same time, they were not ultra left, crazy, insane. They represented millions of people. They were elected to parliaments. They were the government in places like Vietnam and Angola and places like that. And those people are serious, are serious folks. And if you can talk and consume, the kind of publications and the theoretical material coming out of those kind of communists, not the latest postmodern book, not the Marxism that you find at Barnes and Noble, right? But the Marxism that actually comes from countries like China or, People's Korea or Vietnam that are actually building socialism. It's a totally different thing. It is a totally, completely different thing. I mean, check out the material of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, read what's being published by the Bolivarian socialists of Latin America. Check out the Sandinistas of Nicaragua, right? These people are actual Marxists and socialists, and what they're putting out is completely different than the cultural left in the United States. And, one thing that you mentioned, about the Contras in Latin America, which is fascinating, is so at the same time that they're heavily involved in drug use, right? What else were they promoting? The religious right? They thought the Catholic Church was too communist or something, right? And Pentecostalism, all kinds of crazy evangelical stuff. And so it was like, and again, here they are on both sides, right? It's like in the United States, when I was growing up, it was like, oh, if someone was saying don't do drugs, you immediately put them in the category of crazy right-wing evangelical. But yet the crazy right-wing evangelicals were the people selling the drugs, and it's very similar to Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, fighting the Soviets was Osama bin Laden and the Taliban, right? And they're, really strict, ultra-conservative Muslims pouring acid on the faces of women if they don't wear a headscarf, etc. But they're also selling heroin, right? And that the imperialists love to play that game where they get both sides of it, right? They get both sides. And then, and at the end of the day, right, we're saying you can be rational, right? You can be anti-imperialist and socialist. You can also not be into using drugs. You can also be for building yourself up and building up. The main thing is that I think pessimism is the main tendency that underlies the synthetic left. The synthetic left, at its core, believes that the world is getting worse and worse and worse, and that humanity is a cancer, that the more humanity expands, the more dangerous the world is, that humanity is not, we're not getting to a higher stage of eventually socialism and communism, but rather we're getting worse and worse and worse. And we need to go back to the primitive ways, the Eastern mystical, like that's the essence of the synthetic left. It is a pessimistic movement reflecting the pessimistic views of the ultra rich, of the ultra bourgeoisie, of the entrenched ruling power, Rockefellers, DuPonts, Carnegies, etc. And that optimism, socialist optimism, socialist constructive socialism, growth socialism, a socialism based on optimism is the real antidote. That's what I think. And that if people are optimistic, they won't feel a need to turn to drugs to get happiness. They'll get happiness from building something real in their life, right? And moving ahead and taking responsibility, right? And the things that give people the natural happiness of having a life, I think is the best antidote to this pessimistic, destructive, anti-human drug culture. What do you think?
Definitely. I couldn't agree more. And I think it's just like keeping yourself busy, even if it's gardening, even if it's just like working out. Working out helps me a lot. I try to work out almost every day, and that helps me out because it also sets the day. It sets the tone for the day. If you work out and you exert a lot of energy, you feel good. The rest of the day, you're gonna want to keep yourself good and clean. And I think also for me, like one of the things that has helped me kind of stay away from that stuff is also responsibility. In terms of like, for example, like as I'm getting older, my parents are getting older, like my siblings, and also like I live with my girlfriend Ophelia, like her mom lives with us, and like as I'm getting older and I have more responsibilities of taking care of the people around me, I can't be like high, just like sitting around. And what if something happens and or if I have a kid, like, and if I'm just like getting high somewhere, and something happens to the kid, it's like you're totally screwed up. And so like just having that tremendous amount of responsibility. And I think, like you said earlier, with revolutionaries from around the world, Vietnam, Cuba, Nicaragua, other places, Venezuela, where they have a tremendous responsibility. They're literally representing like millions of people, and anything they do will have repercussions for millions of people. Can you imagine what the U.S. media would do if like a Venezuelan diplomat or something was like getting high and smoking crack in like Manhattan? It would have huge consequences. And even it's interesting because when Che Guevara was in Uruguay, in Montevideo, for a conference, I forget the name of the conference, but it was like a pan-Latin American conference. And this was like a year or two after Cuba liberated with the revolution. There was all these attempts to, in Che Guevara's notes, I have a good anthology of his notes. He talks about how there were people there planted in Montevideo who, after the conferences, they would like invite them to go to these parties and drink and do drugs. And he had a rule. He said the Cuba delegation, once the conference is over, back to the rooms. Like, don't go out, don't do any of that, because he knew it was a trick. Because that's how like evil and the imperialists control people, by your appetites. If someone can control your appetites, they can control your desires, they can control you, they can control everything you stand for. And I feel like that's kind of what we're seeing with the Bidens, like Hunter Biden and Joe Biden. I mean, I don't want to go too deep into that rabbit hole, but we know that the Biden family has a lot of dirty laundry, and a lot of that may be connected with the certain appetites that they have, and that's how you get controlled. And so I feel like for me, it also took me a while to understand what truth is. And Che Guevara talks about this, Lenin talks about this, is like communists are for the truth, living a true life, living a healthy life where you don't lie, don't do drugs, don't betray the people who support you. And once you do that, no one can use anything against you. If you're not taking drugs, if you're not lying to people, if you're living an honest, clean life, no one can fuck with you. And I think that's really something that can save you, to help you, and it makes you less paranoid, to be honest.
Well, we have a culture, and I think this is kind of what you're getting at. We have a culture that kind of encourages people to never grow up, encourages people to be children their whole life. But at the end of the day, who is the least free person in our society? A child, right? They have no rights at all, right? Somebody else tells them what to do all the time. But as you become an adult and take on adult responsibilities, right, then you have freedom. And that as we have a culture that really kind of wants people to be children for their entire life, I think that in its essence is about taking away our freedom, right? That just because you are able to have a lot of fun doesn't really make you free, right? When someone else is managing you through social media, through drugs, through pornography, that's another addiction that's really widespread in our society at this time. When someone can control you that way, you're not really free. But when you're an adult, when you're consciously taking responsibility for your own actions, making the decision, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to take care of this, I'm going to make sure this is taken care of, that is freedom. And that socialism's goal is to give everyone that level of freedom.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But Caleb, I'm so glad I was able to talk to you. I think we should do this more often. And I love this topic because it's like, it affects the personal life too, because once you are able to understand how much of a weapon drugs are, and that's exactly the title, we're talking about this book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, by John Potash. I would love to, I don't know if he's still alive. I'm wondering, if you, maybe I can try to get a copy over to you if you want to read it.
Please do. Yeah.
And then, maybe we could even try to see like where this guy is. I don't even know who he is, but I just find it fascinating.
Very good. Well, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Check out Anticonquista, where Ramiro's stuff is widely available. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Caleb.
Yep.